Hello everyone. In this session we're going to talk about anonymisation and deletion, with the main focus on anonymisation, and hopefully that will become clear as to why that carries the lion's share of the discussion. So we've just got a few points that we want to raise via a PowerPoint screen, and then we'll go straight into donorflex and discuss these things. So anonymisation versus deletion is a key aspect of the conversation. When should we delete data, and what data should we delete? And should that be everything, or should it be anonymising certain elements of data? So by anonymisation, we're saying keep the transactional pieces of data, the facts of the donations that have been received, the events that have been attended, the regular giving agreements that have been had during the lifetime of the supporter, and so on and so forth. But ensure that the identity of the donor who had given you those donations, had attended those events, did have those regular giving agreements, is completely gone. So completely anonymised, so that you as a charity don't lose that all-important ability to analyse your data completely, but you aren't in danger of retaining data, subject data, that you shouldn't hold. So you'll see that you have the ability to be able to delete data and anonymise data. So talking about deletion first. Deletion, you've always been able to do. You've always been able to delete a record. It's sitting in the records utilities section of donorflex, and you can see that you can delete a record. The rules around deleting a record are that as soon as you have something significant on the record, for example, a transaction, deletion is not possible. So there are a number of clients who find themselves in a position where they have many records on the database that have no significant data attached to them, purely names and addresses, probably not even any indication in a communication as to why that record was even created, but they are there all the same. And they feel very certain that those records ought to be deleted. You, within the model now, will be able to not just delete one record that has insignificant amounts of data on it, but also many records in one go. It's a very simple task, very similar to the one that you've always been done. So we're not really going to spend much time on that in this practical session. But what we are going to spend the focus of amount of time on is anonymisation. In both of these contexts, it is really important that each organisation gets their security and permissions right. So I'm saying here that you, as always with areas of functionality in donorflex, have the ability to say which users have access to which areas of functionality. It is important that you only give the anonymisation tool, for example, to someone who fully understands the enormity of the action they're about to do unto their database. Bearing in mind that, as I said right at the outset, our concern was that once we anonymise or delete data, it has gone. There is no way of getting it back, with the exception of a backup and a restore from backup, but we'll come back to that a little bit later in this session. You need to think about who should have access. You're going to go into the users and permissions area of the database and make sure that only the right people, the right users, have the correct permissions. From a security perspective, we also want you to know that there will be an unlock code that is attached to the utility. For those of you who have access to bulk tools within the database, you'll be very familiar with having to ask us for an unlock code to do certain tasks, including the SQL query tool, for example. This unlock code you will ask for, and we will do our due diligence and say, what are you using it for? What do you want to do? Are you sure you're comfortable that you're deleting the right data, etc., etc., etc. That's because we care. It's not because we're trying to be overbearing. The other thing that we need to let you know is that if someone contacts us and they don't have the correct permissions to run this function, we won't help them get those permissions. We will request of that person that they seek senior management authorization that comes to us in order for us to be able to show that individual how they can acquire the permission to that functionality. And again, it's because we want to ensure that the right people are doing those tasks, and we're being the carer, we're being the custodian of your data as far as it is our place to do it. And that's important because our responsibility begins and ends with what is inside the database. If someone, for example, requests to be forgotten, that person isn't just saying that in relation to what's inside your database, they're saying it in terms of every area where you may hold their data. And that includes filing cabinets, spreadsheets that have been used for various functions over time, maybe your other databases in which that record is held. So it is important that you appreciate that our responsibility begins and ends only where donorflex is concerned. However, one of the byproducts of the process will be that we create a file that includes the donor number of all the records that you have anonymized. This should give you some insight into being able to, for example, search the network for documents. They hold that donorflex number. If you're creating documents through donorflex, through the communications module, then that will automatically hold that donor number at the front of the file name of that document. And so that should make finding those documents more straightforward. Obviously, we can't be held responsible for those things that are in your filing cabinets and elsewhere, as previously just mentioned. The other thing that we've done in terms of making sure that we're playing our part in this process is to ensure that there are some pieces of data that would prevent the anonymisation taking place. So, for example, and we'll look in more detail in a moment, but for example, if someone is a lottery player with credit on their record in the lottery module, we won't allow you to anonymise that record. And there are many more. And as I said, we'll come to that in a moment. So I am going to go ahead and demonstrate that process. We're going to do it with just a few records because the process is the process, whether you're doing that with 100 records, 1,000 records, or 5 or 6, as we are going to do today. And then we're going to look at the outcome of what we have done and the impact that has on the way we then use the database. So I'm going to nip into donorflex and we're going to look, first of all, at the records area of the database. So in records, you've got record utilities. And as you can see, in addition to those options that you are used to having, so rename a record, delete a record, merge a record, you've got this lovely anonymisation tab. Just going into delete a record, this gives you the ability to still delete a record as you saw, and deletion of records are available in transit file utilities, which will delete records en masse. Again, only those records that has no significant data attached to them. So I'm going to focus on anonymised records. For those of you who are in charge of the management of the database users, you will know that you can change permissions in the tools and utilities area of the database. That's sitting here, and it's in configure donorflex, system utilities, and users and permissions. And you need to make sure, as I said, that those permissions are set correctly for the users who are going to be allowed to use this tool. So as a recap, right at the beginning of the anonymisation process, you're seeing the 2 reasons why you are going to want to use this tool. And it's either going to be because Within your own privacy policy, thus your section on data retention, you will have probably got some rules that specify how long you're going to keep a data subject. Those rules may be something like, after 7 years of no contact, no communication, no engagement, we will set your records to inactive. That means you won't be part of our active population. Alternative, you may have said things like, after 7 years of non-engagement, we will remove your records from the database. So it's only when you're talking about removing the data from the database, not setting it into a sort of a safe place called the inactive records, is when you have committed to remove data that you would use this tool. Here we've put an expression in place, which is where you are saying you have redundant records where you have no longer to be holding the data at all. Okay, and that is, again, being clear that it is because of some kind of privacy policy, data retention policy that your organization holds. The other reason is that someone may have requested their right to be forgotten, and you have actually said, yes, we will acquiesce to your request and we will fulfill your right to be forgotten. So those are the two reasons that you would be using this tool. It is important, we'll come to this later, that you don't mix the population that we are anonymizing across these two reasons. And that will become clear when we get there. And we can talk about that when we get to that point. Importantly, we are trying very, very hard to say that there's no undo facility. Yeah, you cannot go, oops, I didn't mean to do that. It's gone. With the caveat, of course, that if you did it right now and you went, oh, that was a mistake, you could go back to backup. Going back to backup presents other issues. So you do need to think in your processes what you need to do in order to ensure that there is a record that an anonymisation process took place. Imagine, for example, today, this morning, I go through an anonymisation process for my database records that we have fully and appropriately identified as being redundant. We do the lottery draw at 3 o'clock, and at 3 o'clock, we find an issue and we have to go back to backup. And the backup that we have is last night's backup. When we restore that last night's backup, we will have reinstated all those records. Not because we've taken that file and put them back in, but we have actually reinstated the whole of the database. So you do have to bear in mind that if you have any backups and you have to go back to backup for a purpose, that backup may indeed contain records that subsequent to that backup being taken had been anonymized. So you do need to think about those things. The second thing that we are saying here is that you need this unlock code. So I've told you about the unlock code. You'll call us, we'll give you an unlock code. It is a very specific code. It's not the same unlock code that you would use for other areas of functionality that you ask for an unlock code for. And we will ask you to pop that unlock code in the unlock code tab. When I click on activate, that then will activate this area of functionality. This remains activated whilst you are logged in. At the bottom of this screen are the rules of anonymisation. In the intro to this, I mentioned that we are acting as custodians of your data by ensuring that any aspect of data that we would deem this record to be active because it sits on their record will stop anonymisation. So as I said in my example earlier, if a lottery player has credit on a lottery play, you will not be able to anonymise this record. So this list is a list of all those areas which will prevent the anonymisation taking place. So things like they have current regular giving agreement or agreements. So that means not that there's a regular giving agreement on their record, but that regular giving agreement is neither completed nor terminated. So it's active. If you use the membership module, they have an active membership. It may be that there is a collecting box that has been issued to that record that has not yet been brought back. A current pledge, so they've pledged to do some activity for you and it's not flagged as complete. A legacy. If there is a legacy sitting on the record, you won't be able to anonymise the record. Campaign segments, easily forgotten actually, but if someone has been party to a campaign and that campaign is still active, you won't be able to anonymise this record. Only when that campaign is seen as being done and dusted and you flagged it to being not in use, will you be able to anonymise that record. Importantly, many people don't appreciate that these two areas of functionality exist on the database. You can connect a record as a contact on another record. That is called something called the own donor link. You'll see that if you look at a contact and it gives you in the additional information their donor number. That is an own donor link. That would have to be resolved before you can anonymise the record, because effectively, if we anonymise a record and we throw away a contact that's linked to another record, that could cause you significant issues. Similarly, there are people who use our group mailing functionality that will need looking at before you can anonymise the record. In the group mailing context, one record will have a contact defined as the group mailing recipient. That means that when other records have been linked via the group mailing function for mailing purposes, so that one envelope, one letter goes to that entire group, if that record that we want to anonymise holds the name of the recipient, then that will stop the anonymisation from happening. So these things need to be resolved. It's not like, oh my goodness, we can't do this now. It's that they need to be resolved before anonymisation. So in that instance, what you would do is you need to make one of the other group members the group mailing recipient. So it's not about telling you you can't do these things. It's about telling you that you need to resolve certain issues before you can do them. There are a number of things around lottery. So if someone is linked to a round or a canvasser, if a lottery player is flagged as self-excluded, clearly that has great legal connotations. I've talked about remaining credit. If there are tickets assigned to that record and the draw has not yet been run, that will prevent anonymisation. And if someone is the purchaser of a lottery voucher that has remaining credit on it, very similar to obviously the play with credit. For those of you who use the stock merchandise system, you will know that stock can be held at different stock locations, and those stock locations can be records. So if you have a record that is acting as a stock location, you will again need to resolve that before you are able to anonymise the record. And finally, any unclaimed or unsubmitted gift aid will prevent an anonymisation. So once you're aware of these things, a bit like when you're merging records, you become very familiar with the sorts of things that would stop a merge, the things that you know will be lost or the things that you know will be retained. So it's really important that if I come back to the point that I made really early on, which is there will be very few people in your organisation that you will want to give this function to. And it's the people who know the database best and understand how all of the elements of the database fit together and the consequences of making changes. If I click next now, we're asking you actually to commit that you have checked certain things. So, for example, you have deleted all record contacts, checked all record contacts, you've checked the profiling data, you've checked that records don't have biography items that should be retained, and so on and so on and so forth. All of these pieces of data are things that you should be looking at to make sure that you are confident that you've checked before we throw away data. We don't want to throw away data unless you've confirmed that it's throwawayable. So we would ask you to go through these processes and just check that you have done all of those things. And they include making sure that you've deleted any backups of the database as requested, maybe sure that you deleted any old mailing files or analysis files as required, and so on and so forth. So we're trying to help you to get the data, the entire data of your database in good order before you do your anonymisation process. We can't do these things for you. So we're asking you to obviously do that yourselves. What file do I need to use in order to do anonymisation? Well, the file needs to be an XLS file, not a CSV file. It will contain 2 columns with a header row, and those 2 columns will hold the donor number and the donor name. You will then load that file into this tab. So I'm going to browse to my file, which is sitting in my letters folder, into here. And then coming back to the screen before this, I am going to be stipulating the legal basis on which I am anonymising the records within this file. So just coming back to what I said earlier, please make sure that this file only contains either those who have requested directly, so they have asked you to anonymise their data, or you've decided that you're going to anonymise our data, because you're going to stamp the changelog with this knowledge. Speaking of the changelog, anything within the changelog will be deleted as well. There is no point in us giving you a tool that anonymises the record and then keeps the changelog where you'll be able to see all of the data that you held before you did the anonymisation. So do be mindful that when we say it's gone, we really do mean it's gone. So you're going to choose whichever of these is the correct reason for you anonymising this data. In a moment, I'm going to click Run. And when we click Run, it's going to give us a 10-second opportunity to go, no, stop. But once that 10 seconds is done, it's gone. That data is being anonymised and there's no stop to the process. Before we do it, I want to go and look at an example record so that we can do that task of evaluating what has the process done. So I'm going to go into record management and I'm going to choose a record that's in my anonymisation file. Hopefully you can see here that we've got a record name, an address, contact numbers, an email address. We have some financial transactions on the record. And when I look at the financial transactions, I can look at the transaction itself. And when I open the transaction, you can see that the transaction has, I'm just going to copy that journal number so that we can go and look at this transaction afterwards. It has free text. So our IRO text, our comment text fields are all free text that could indeed identify this record. So we absolutely need this to go. Similarly, if we've got anything in our journal memo, free text field, it will get wiped. So this is a record that's going to be in my anonymisation file. Now, what we've done is we've produced a list, which is a short list. One of those records is going to not be able to be anonymised. So I can demonstrate what happens if you meet a record that doesn't satisfy the criteria of all those issues that would prevent anonymisation. And we've got an example of one that we can go back to look at what happens after anonymisation. So I'm just going to close this at this point in time. And I'm going to close the record and we'll come back to that in a moment. So I'm here. I've got my file. I've done my due diligence on all of the data that I need to deal with that is part and parcel of the bigger anonymisation topic. And now I want to run. There's my 10-second opportunity to go stop. If I want to do that, I click cancel. I'm not going to do that and I'm going to let it go through the process. That is now anonymising the records it can, and it will produce 3 files at the end of this process. Okay, so our process is complete. However, the first thing that we're told is that some errors were encountered, and those errors have been logged in this file. And the file is the file that was my original file name _errors. We're going to go and take a look at that file in just a moment. The second thing that the database is doing is it's saying, I'm giving you a list of all of the recently records that were just anonymized, and that's going to be in this file. Now, what's really important is the only thing that's sitting in this file is a record number. Okay, there's no identifying data, it's just a record number. I'm going to click OK, so thank you very much for that. And then the final thing is that we have used a file of data to generate the process, to run the process. That file of data holds a donor number and a donor name. There is no reason why you should retain that data file. As the final task, if we've done everything else, this is the point at which we go, okay, this is the last time we have any file of data on our database that held that donor name. So on this occasion, I'm going to say, yes, please delete that file. Now I'm going to go to my letters folder, and I'm going to look at my exception file, and I'm going to look at the file that shows me what records have been anonymized. So in my anonymisation folder, I'll take my errors first. This will open up a file in Excel, and it will present to me the records that it couldn't anonymize. Here you see the donor number of that record, the donor name, so the original 2 columns in the file, and the reason or reasons this record couldn't be anonymized. And here you see that this record cannot be anonymized because it still has active plays. It tells you what to do. You cannot anonymize the record if they have a legacy. It tells you what you have to do. You cannot anonymize a record if they have unclaimed or unsubmitted gift aid, and this person does. So this record, which is record number 10185, has not been anonymized for justifiable reasons. And I now look at, so don't save that file, and I look at the ones that were anonymized. That is just the list of the record numbers. Okay, that record number was one that we have anonymized. So I'm going to go back into record management, and I'm going to look at my record, which was Sam's record, if you recall. And as I go into record management and choose my toggle button, what's here? Nothing. Can't see Sam. So your toggle bar will remove the identity of the records that you were last looking at if those were a record that you had just anonymized. So I need to go in and put the donor number in. And here you can see that all of that lovely information that identified Sam has now gone. Telephone numbers, etc., all of those tables have disappeared. The change log, if I look at the change log, anything to do with that record that was part of the change log before anonymization has gone. The only thing that remains is when the anonymization took place, who did the anonymization, and then over here, the reason why you did it. So a little earlier in this session, I told you that those 2 reasons were important and that they would get stamped on the record to say the basis on which you made the decision to anonymize these records. And therefore, here you can see that that was organization imposed, because that's the one I chose. We can still see that transactions exist, and we absolutely want to know that transactions exist. But if I try to open the transaction from here, I can't, which is why I took the transaction number. If I go into amendments and I just pop the transaction number into here and click OK, you can now see that the in respect of text and the comment lines, and had we had anything in the journal memo, has all been wiped clean. So bear in mind that anything which is a text field will get stripped, anything which can identify the donor will get stripped, but the actual transaction themselves with their source codes, application codes, and so on and so forth will remain in the database record. So a true anonymization of the record, as opposed to deleting really critical, important data that you want to be able to still use for analysis purposes. We said we'd look at the consequences of anonymization, and I'm not going to go and show you all of the inquiries on the database. I think it'll be fairly self-explanatory that every inquiry will have the same principle. We're going to go into Power Search. And if I were to say, I just want to find all the individuals on the database, so I'm going to choose type I and click Run, then we're going to start seeing a new piece of text sitting inside the dialog boxes at the end of inquiries. And what this is telling me is how many records I found out of a total number of records on the database, but it's telling me the anonymized records were excluded from this search. Yeah. So that means that my list of records that are the results of my query, whether this be a pledge inquiry, an income inquiry, a regular giving inquiry, a lottery inquiry, all of those inquiries will, by default, in the first instance, exclude anonymized records. Clearly, there are times when you want those anonymized records to be there. So we have at the end or within each query, giving you the opportunity to change that default and to either include anonymized records. So if I ran that search again, this would then find all individuals on the database, including anonymized records, suitably anonymized, obviously. Or I could say, actually, I only want to find the anonymized records because I want to know how many records we actually anonymized. And when I click Run, that will only find the records that have been anonymized on my database. And as I said, in each area of the database, there is a query tool, and in each query tool, you'll have the opportunity to change the default setting, which excludes anonymized records, to either include or only find. So I hope, in summary, that as we've looked at this piece of new functionality, the ability to anonymize our data, to legally comply with any commitments we have made or make in our privacy policy in terms of data retention, you can feel very comfortable that you can do it. You should feel very comforted that there are checks and balances happening in the process that will stop you throwing away active data. And indeed, that the permissions around this module will ensure that only the right people, the right users, have access to this functionality. That's all from me on this topic, but I do implore you to get in touch. If you've got any questions, any things that are not as clear as they should be, then don't hesitate to get in touch and we can have a chat. Okay, thanks for your time.